My favorite humans here with me today, Linda Sun, who is an educator, Asian American feminist, and a former worm farmer. She's going to tell you a little bit about that.
Screaming.
And then we have Ashley Jeffery, who is the director of special projects. These are two of my friends that I met at Harvard, who are honestly, I can't even put into words the way that these women both see me and are two versions of me. We're all versions of each other, right? Where we can be super into education, getting real down and deep into these high level topics, but then also being the dumbest, goofiest, craziest people you've ever met in your entire life. So that is why I love you both.
I feel like that's accurate. That's
right?
Accurate.
Right? Yeah. So welcome, guys. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having us.
You're
Can't wait for that check to clear.
Oh my goodness! You'll be waiting a while.
Yeah, I'm at $1,000 an hour, so if you could just, why not?
Severely undercut me. That's fine.
That's that broad money. Okay.
Right. I'm screaming.
So let's get into it. I want to check in with you guys just like we do with our babies in the classroom. Give us a rose and a thorn for your week, your life, your day, anything. I know it's early on a Sunday, but give us a rose and a thorn. Linda, why don't you start us off?
I'm going to give 2 roses. Is that allowed?
Yes.
Oh, okay. All right. This is not like The Bachelor or whatever.
No.
Great. So 1 rose is obviously being here with y'all. I'm so excited for this. I think it's going to be so fun. And I just can't wait to talk about all the things. And the second is that I recently have been going house hunting. I'm going to be buying my first home soon, which is really intimidating, but also really exciting. Ooh. And I went out with my realtor yesterday for the first time and was like, oh my God, there's cute stuff in my price range, which I didn't know was possible. Yes. So I'm very excited for that. Yes.
Wait, so you're buying here?
Yeah, I'm buying in DC.
Oh, she's staying. She's staying. She's a permanent resident now.
I don't
That's what I heard.
Okay.
That's what I heard.
Yeah. At least a stable resident.
We'll take it.
Yes, a stable resident. Yes.
So what's your thorn?
My thorn is definitely work. Education is real rough, which I'm sure Ashley will talk more about later too. Mm-hmm. It's just rough out there. The Great Resignation is real. Mm-hmm. I have so many openings on my team and not many applicants. I don't know what's going on. And so everyone is overworked. And so then more people start quitting because they're overworked. And then we have more this. It just is a self-perpetuating cycle. So we're trying really hard to bring folks in to kind of help stem that. But yeah, it's been rough. Yeah.
I love that you hit right on the topic of this episode. Since it's the first one, I thought it would be great to just literally talk about how education is trash. Of course, with the caveat that there's so much beauty and amazing, powerful things within it. That's the glory of it, why I am a lifelong educator. But there's a lot of trash, and so we're going to definitely get into that. All right, Ashley, what's your rose and what's your thorn?
My rose for the week, last night I got to go to a queer bar in DC. Linda, don't hate me, because I feel like every time I go out to a queer bar, you're like, oh my gosh, tell me you're going, and then
and then you go without me. You go without me. Yeah. All right. Fine. That's fine.
But last night was one of my adventure nights where I'm just okay, I'm just gonna go with the flow. So we started at Dirty Goose and then we went to As You Are. But anyway, shout out to As You Are bar. I went to this queer bar. It was they had made a vision for what they wanted to have, mostly POC, super inclusive space, and it was just such a different vibe from all the other queer clubs in DC, and it was just lovely. So being able to go out last night, I danced until 2-3 o'clock in the morning, just felt like my full queer self. That was really nice. And then my thorn for the week is that my fiance just went back home, so I miss her. Aww. But yeah, she'll be back in a week. So
fiance has such a beautiful ring to it. Your proposal was so glorious, so wonderful.
Thank you,
You look, the suits you guys were wearing. I loved it. I love all of those things. I was really happy for you. Are you feeling like in your newly engaged bliss right now?
Yeah, we're like obnoxious. So like, I'll be like, "Can you pass the butter, fiance?" Or like, "Oh, you dropped that, fiance." Like, just to wear it out. And like every person that will listen, I'm just like, "Oh, well, I'm recently engaged." I don't know if you want to know the story. I mean, I can tell you. I just, So anyway, here are pictures.
Why don't you tell us the story right now, if you don't mind, if you've got the time?
Yeah. So I'll do the shorter version. Okay. Both me and Alia, I feel like, grew up as individuals and as a couple in DC. So I really want to incorporate DC in our proposal itself. And so I went up to the Kennedy Center, and when we recorded, or we were taking pictures up there, I wanted to get shots of DC and even like Arlington, like in the actual photos. And so she thought we were just going to photo shoot because that's the type of person she is. She'll just randomly get really dressed up and look really nice for like an event / photos. So anyway, when we were up there, I like pulled out this thing that I had like written down, and like this is one of those moments where I was like, I know I'm the child of like a teacher, especially an elementary school teacher, because like I printed it out, I glue sticked it down, I like cut the little curves on the corner, like
the glue stick.
Where did you even find a glue stick? Tell me you stole it from work.
At my literal school.
Stole it from work.
I borrowed it from my peers. Okay.
Was that both federal grant money, Ashley?
Right?
Absolutely not, ma'am. We are privately funded.
I would say she's at a charter. That was a private donation money.
Right. Those 22 cents were from someone else. So, anyway, so I like put it out. So she said that later when we were like reflecting on it, my fiance was like, "Oh, when you pulled it out and it was just like printed out, nicely cut on pink paper, like to match my pink suit." Like she was like, I thought maybe that was what's happening. So, yeah. So anyway, so we did that first, and then I got down on one knee, asked her if she would marry me. I read her the words.
God.
Yeah, and then. And then the second surprise was that, so she thought we were going to her grad school gala, which just happened to be the same day, but we're actually driving to the surprise post-engagement party. So it was like my best friends who came in from like New York, her best friends who came in from like Germany, Chicago, like one of her close friends from here, like in DC, and everyone was just in there. And so like the second surprise was her best friend from Germany, just like being here with her partner. And yeah, so we just like turned up, we danced, like a friend of mine like did the event planning. My boss let me use her house. Like it was just amazing. So yeah, it was a really good time.
It looked really, really beautiful. I mean, I was so happy for you. Like looking at all those stories, like, oh my God, this is. And I was telling Ashley too, like I have a lot of friends. Like y'all know that I'm like constantly at weddings, and I have a lot of friends.
You are, yeah.
So I have a lot of it, because I've had so many different friend groups over the years. And then as all of them are getting married, like, I just keep in touch with so many people. But I have to say, I have never been, like, on this side where the person who is proposing and I are so close, where it's like, look at the ring, look at this. And so Ashley was, like, sharing all of that with me. And I was, like, on that journey with her, so excited. Because I'm like, usually it's the girl on the other side, like, sending an email being like, this is the ultimatum. If you do not propose to me, we're done. Right? That's
or we can go on this, and we can go on this TV show now.
Right.
Oh my God, no, that TV show. Listen, I already was watching Love is Blind, and I feel horrible for watching that. Ashley kind of sort of convinced me, and it's only because they're based out of Chicago.
And because it's great television.
Yeah.
It's too much. Anyway, all right. Thank you guys for sharing your rose and your thorn. I think my rose is definitely starting this podcast, and the fact that I feel really comfortable right now because I was so like shy when I was gonna start. And what I actually had to do when I did the intro is I called up my brother and I was like, will you please hop into this like session with me so I can read the intro to you so that there can be someone on the other side. Like one of my fatal flaws is that I constantly need reassurance, but because I know that I need reassurance, I get the right people around me who are gonna be like, no, you're great, you're fine. And so he was in the recording session with me listening while I did it. And that helped me, like, loosen up. And then, he was like, yeah, you're really great. Like, you sound nice. Like, it's wonderful. And then told me, you need to make a YouTube also. And I was like, okay. So that was my rose. My thorn is just that this is, like, a new thing. And there's so much that you can do to make something better. my boyfriend's sister borrowed me this microphone because she does all of this stuff. And yesterday she was like, you could get this and you can get this and buy this like switchboard. And I was like, no, I want to keep it as like simple as possible. But I know that I am a person who like tends to go over the top. So I might end up buying all this stuff that I don't need to. That's my thorn, which is not bad. That's not a horrible problem to have.
Yeah. It's like when people say, what's a strength and what's a weakness? And your weakness is like a strength. Like seriously, secretly.
You're like, I want it to be perfect.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, my brother was the one who called me a perfectionist the first time. And I was like, I'm not a perfectionist. Nothing I do is good enough. And he's like, and yet you continue to strive for it. That's a perfectionist. Oh.
Pew, pew. Damn, Gen Z be coming, bro.
Right? Read my whole life. Anyway, speaking of trash, let's get into... Not that my brother's trash, he's great. Let's get into some trash or treasure with some current events. Y'all ready to talk about the world around us?
Let's do it. It's all trash.
I can feel the intellectual anxiety building now.
Ooh. The funny thing is I've been wanting to do this section, like to talk about these concepts, but I cannot lie and say that I have a lot of base knowledge about it. It's usually our friend, all of us are friends with him, our friend James, who brings these topics up, and then I'm like, tell me more, James, because I don't know what the heck is going on. And so this first one he actually did share with us, which is, of course, about student loans. So James shared an article that said Biden is proposing that student loan forgiveness be income-driven rather than just an overall arching whatever. Cancellation, yeah. And the funny part to me is I'm like, is he just giving us like different ideas to just keep stalling? He's like, well, have you considered income based? Have you considered just the teachers?
First, I just want to say, even though James and I were in the education policy management program together, he and I only talk about dating. We never.
I'm crying.
He does not send these things to me. I'm like, what does that say about my friendship with James?
Oh, that's
but either way,
he's good about talking about dating. He definitely our chat I think has that balance. What did you say, Ashley? Where it's like dating, real life. Here's some politics.
Talking shit. Yeah.
There was a podcast on the Daily, or an episode on the Daily that talked about like the delaying of the student loans, where like basically I forget exactly what it said, but it basically said like Biden is basically in this pickle where like he's kind of delayed so long. He can't like not do it, but he doesn't really have a plan of how to do it. So like, there's definitely, to me, some stalling tactics probably at play. That said, like, do I think somebody who took out a loan who's now like, I don't know, really wealthy or like comes from a wealthy family and decided to take out the loans for the interest or for the like tax deduction on the interest portion, like should they get their loan forgiven? I'm not feeling great about that. So I do think that there should be something to do with that, but I also think income is like, it's so rough because I have a high income, especially in education personally, I think, but I don't have like generational wealth, right? I don't have like a trust fund. I don't have like something, so somebody could be making less money than me, but their parents are paying their rent, you know what I'm saying? Like and that is a hard thing policy-wise to, like, really kind of nail down and implement, blah, 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 like, acknowledging kind of all the complexity of that. But I do think there should be something done to acknowledge that. To acknowledge, like, yeah, not everyone deserves the same level of loan cancellation.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to mull around, too. Like, how is it that, like, I think of myself, and that's the problem that I have. Of course, you put yourself into that position. I'm like, so if I continue to make more and more money, then I should be expected to pay all of this back. But at what point does my interest become so high? Like, because coming out of school, I went straight into teaching, and in Chicago, we're like one of the highest paid districts in the nation. And if I'm making $47,000 when I first came out, and then at some point, in my career, making $100,000, maybe more, the interest is still building up because I was never able to afford it at the beginning, right? Mm-hmm. So that just because I become high income at some point, does that make up for the time that I was still building my own wealth? I don't know. So I don't have an answer, but I just think of it in those terms. And I'm like, it's a little funny.
I was going to say, like, Linda, when we say, like, wealthy, like, let's talk numbers. Like, a wealthy family or, like, income level. Let's do both. Where do you think that the bar should stop for folks? like if we're gonna do an income-based, or is it income-driven, income-based?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, what's the number at which point, like, you just don't get it anymore?
Yeah, for you personally, if you're like, yo, if I had to throw out this number, because, you know, we work in policy. Well, I used to work in policy. But what would you say?
Girl, you put me on the spot right now.
Yeah, because, well, I'm asking too, right? Because to Sabrina's point, it's like at some point, you know, ideally, we're getting these degrees, but I still have this debt, right? Like, my income is increasing, but my debt is still right there. Like, you know, like,
that is also increasing.
It's all, well, you know, pause for 2 years, thanks to Big Daddy Biden, but like could be increasing later. So when I think about that, I'm like, okay, I might be in a certain income bracket, but it doesn't mean I could really afford paying all this money back. Like, you know, like it changes.
I'm literally thinking, so a friend of mine just got a new job. She's making like $200,000 a year, which is a lot in my opinion. But at the same time, I also know that like she actually pays her mom's rent. Her mom's rent and all of her mom's like basic living expenses, right? Bills, blah, 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 transportation, all that stuff. So is she really making $200,000 a year? You know what I mean? She's not actually a household of one, but she can't claim her mom as like a you know, like a yeah. So so that's like what's giving me pause when I think about like, so that makes me want to throw out a number like 300,000. But then I'm like thinking about like, I don't know, you know, like some kid who went to B school and comes from a really good family and maybe took out some loans or whatever, but like is now making $200,000-$300,000 in finance, and it's only going up from there. You know, like like is that
it's a hard thing to peg down, and I think that they're gonna struggle with that too, especially because they don't really want to do this. Like nobody really, the people in charge do not want to have our loans forgiven. They want us to live in the debt forever.
Also, does the, I actually don't know the answer to this. Does the loan forgiveness, does that include graduate school loans? Or would that,
they've been floating different options. Okay. But like the original, I think like campaign time promise was like federal loans will be forgiven. Oh, and it wasn't quite, you know, delineated. Right. And then it was, okay, we'll put we'll forgive loans for people who went to HBCUs or like went to public schools, and then it was refined to undergrads for those same two categories. So I feel like it's kept changing, and nothing's been like quite, you know, written down. And so I would posit, I think that everyone should get the forgiveness. One, because I think that if we, well, hear me out, this is my opinion, it don't got to be yours. Our professor used to say that. I love that. I think if we're trying to move towards a country that is going to be less individualistic and more based on community and help younger folks, right? Trying to make those distinctions between, well, you came from a wealthy family and here are these things, but not knowing on paper especially what all of your money is going towards. It could be going to just you, it could be going to your family members, you could be paying for a little kid, for your siblings, like college, like whatever. Trying to delineate that then makes it tiers, right? And once we start adding tiers, I think it just becomes that much harder to nail down, like, well, this person should get it, this person shouldn't, and then people are gonna be like, well, why do they get it? Here's my problem, here's everything I have. It's just like, yo, just across the board, it's been 2 years and everybody's loans have been on pause. Everybody's, right? If that's the case, then let's give forgiveness for all, and I think it would be a good faith gesture. Personally, I think if Biden forgave loans, he could do anything his presidency, bro. Like, he could do anything and we would accept it, bro. This man would be like, yo, I'm about to raise taxes to the ultimate level. We'd be like, okay. He'd be like, no more houses available for 5 years. I'd be like, damn, that's crazy. I guess my apartment gonna have to suit me. Like, he could do anything. And I think that I understand that there are critics about it, but I think if we're, again, moving towards this more just society, those people who say, well, I had to pay off my loans, like, why shouldn't these people have to pay them off? Like, that's not the type of world we're trying to live in, right? I would never say I had a bad, you know, elementary school or high school experience. I think kids should have to go through that too. It's like, no, absolutely not. I want them to have better and do better, right? So that's my very left take. But
I love it. Thank you for being such a positive socialist. Thank you.
Correct. That whole culture of like, I had to pay my dues is like so white supremacist capitalist, you know? Like, it's so fucked up. Like, why would you want
it's some
somebody
bootstrap
to suffer?
Shit.
Yeah, like, why would you want somebody to suffer the way you suffered? Like, fine, you learn lessons from that suffering, but like, first of all, well, this is a very like, this is a lesson my mom used to teach me as a child. This is how you also know that, like, my mom did not sugarcoat shit. It was just like, everybody suffers in life. You suffer sooner, you suffer later. Like, it's going to happen. So, you know, you don't need to, like, put it on other people. Like, it's going to happen no matter what. So, yeah, Ashley, listening to you, hearing you talk about that, I feel like, one, like, implementation is always where good policy goes to die. That's part one.
Yes,
Like,
yes, final answer.
Yeah, like, always, you know, there's always going to be a critic, and sometimes the simplest way, the easiest implementation actually is just the best way to go to actually just be able to move forward. Like, I remember, like, when COVID was breaking out in 2020 and all these schools were like, what do we do? What do we do? What do we do? And really trying to, like, plan down to the most minute detail. But, you know, the schools that kind of made the decision earlier up front to be like, you know what, we're just going to plan for a fully virtual 2020-2021 school year and made that decision early, they were actually able to, like, make a plan and make a good plan and do it versus, like, waiting to the last minute and doing some scramble. So
you're so right. That's so,
I feel like
yeah,
I feel like they just need to make a call, because nothing's going to be, you know, nothing's going to be amazing.
Yeah.
But
yeah, just got to stick to it.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. So our next topic, this kind of like, it's these things kind of blow my mind, but then they don't when you really look at it. Is he the governor of Greg Abbot of Texas?
Governor.
Yeah, he wants to put something into play where Texas will not pay to educate undocumented children.
Oh, I forgot about this.
This man is scum, bro. He's really scum.
I literally pictured, like, this is horrible, but I'm like, what? Like, I'm like shaking my fist, like, well, what's the point? Like, what are you doing? What is the point? Why is this the hill that you would like to stand on? Is like making kids be uneducated? What benefit does this have?
I mean, it's not about societal benefit. It's just about political, you know, riling up his political base, getting the votes. Is it to deter?
Like, is there a big idea that, like, okay, then more undocumented kids won't come to Mexico from Mexico to Texas, because then there won't be education for them?
I mean, I think that's the idea, but it's all dumb. Like it
Say more.
It does not make sense.
Right.
You're not solving the root of the issue. So all of this is, like you said, Linda, it's for fodder. Like, I want to look good. I want my base to feel like I'm tough on insert ridiculous idea here. And by saying that, I'm going to rob children of being educated. Like, and I think the next level of that argument is, I want, you know, American students to be able to get this education because it's going to make them competitive. It's like, are you joking? Look at our education system.
Oh, yeah.
Texas?
Trash!
Y'all are uncompetitive. Texas, Georgia, Florida, New Mexico. Y'all got to change it up. I don't know, beloved. The babies, they're not well. They're not well. So, like, I don't know. I feel like they do all these things, and I know that they're doing it for political points, but it has real life consequences for these kids and for these babies who don't know that they're even undocumented, right? Like, they're just going to school. They are just living their lives. And I know some people that, like, try to pivot and be like, well, the adults shouldn't, blah, blah. It's like, have you come from a war-torn country? Right. Like I'm asking, for me and my friends.
No, for real,
do you know
real.
anybody who's a first-gen person? That, to leave everything that you came from, bro, and travel sometimes by foot, by sea. Yeah.
I don't even want to leave my block to do things. Like, I don't like leaving my neighborhood. And these folks are moving. No. I just
with
don't
kids?
Understand. With kids.
Have you had a kid?
In the car for 30 minutes?
Bruh. They're singing Encanto all over the goddamn blur. They want to watch Finding Nemo. I'm like, it's not, no, go to bed.
I just
Cocoa
don't
Melon
understand
and
when
shit.
I see all of this stuff, and I'm like, how do you have so much hatred in your heart? That's where it ends up coming down to me, where I'm like, you are a hateful, spiteful person because you bring nothing to the table that is positive and loving or anything. Like, I just don't see care from so many of these folks, and that's the part that blows my mind. Like, how is your entire political standpoint hatred?
This reminds me of so when I taught in China, I moved there, and like all the new teachers like went out for drinks or whatever, and I was sitting there with me, a woman from Cambodia, and a man from France. The man from France was white, and the woman from Cambodia was Asian, and she and I were like connecting over like our, you know, the history of our countries. Like, so for her her family escaped like the Khmer Rouge, Pol Pot, right, and they like fled from Cambodia to literally escape death. And I think they went to France and then ended up going to a couple other places. But, you know, that was her backstory. And then for me, you know, my parents went through the Cultural Revolution and survived all of that and then came to the U.S. eventually. Yeah, so we're just, like, bonding over that. And this white dude from France is just, like, sitting there listening, and he has, like, nothing to contribute to this conversation. Right? Because, like, his family did not come. You know, he's just, like, listening, like and he, you know, of course, acknowledged, like, wow, like, you know, I've never thought about that. You know, he had never thought about, like, he never...
Because why would he have to?
Right. And, like, for her and I, it was just, like, it was almost like a casual... I mean, I wouldn't say casual, but it wasn't, like... It didn't feel like such a deep conversation because it was, like, this is just our lives. And, like, you know, I know the history of Cambodia and she knew the history of China, so it didn't feel like we were exposing these, like, deep family, you know, things because we knew the histories of the countries. But I feel like for a lot of folks in the States, like that's the, you know, literally, like what you said, Ashley, like it's not even their realm of reality. They like have no idea. Yeah. Like
they're so disconnected from it.
So disconnected.
I feel like if anything, the man from France is like the opposite experience of like when people left to be in the military to go invade other places. You know, it's like that's the other perspective, right? Like that's how people here in the States have their like connection. They're like, oh yeah, military this, and like my person had to leave. I'm like, and when they left, where'd they go?
Where did they go?
What did they do?
Doing? Yeah.
Who did they harm? Right? Like, that's the next level, but it's just like, well, they were protecting us. They found our freedom over there. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Trust me, as the daughter of a Marine. Yep.
Is it controversial or is it truth, beloved?
Oh, man.
I just feel like there's no, you know, talking about politics and scoring points and all that shit, like, there is no political candidate who would ever get up there and say that shit.
Yo,
you know what I mean? Like
they'd be destroyed.
Yeah, like they would never.
But this is why politics isn't really like for us. You know what I mean? Like when I say us, I mean like folks who actually want to make a change, which is kind of like why we're in this realm and not the other ones, right?
It's like a middle realm that we're in, where you know the politics, but you know that that's not the world you want to be in. Yeah. Speaking of, though, I do have to say there's the next thing I have on here is a little closer to home. It's a Chicago senator. She is Puerto Rican, and so I have a lot of pride and love for her. And she also worked at the Erickson Institute, which I think I don't know if it's just a Illinois institute or if it's like national, but they work on early childhood. And she, her name is Senator Cristina Pacione-Zayas, and she just passed a bill which is called the Too Young to Test bill, and it's in Illinois, and it prevents state testing from kindergarten to second grade. The fact that this has to be a bill to be passed is mind-blowing to me, but it is very, very important because I've seen this where kids in kindergarten to second grade are so over-tested. And for what? So that you can find out that they, you know, that they don't know what they shouldn't know yet. They're literally in kindergarten. And I don't know if you guys have any experience with early childhood, but these tests actually are so one-on-one individual that it takes up so much of the teacher's classroom time because they have to sit and they have to pull out the iPad, and then it's like, all right, you tell me all these letters, you tell me all these sounds, you tell me this. So like the one-on-ones that you do in like kindergarten first just take up so much time. Teachers end up doing it on their prep, on their lunch. It just really takes away a lot of instruction. And then obviously just the general stress of being tested when you're literally in second grade and then getting those results back. And like, you just haven't even had time to learn how to, like, you know, wipe your butt properly in school. And you're
some adults can't do that either. Keep going.
I know. I taught 5th grade and some of them can't do that either. I'll never forget that day. But anyway.
Every teacher has like random ass stories, pun intended, like that. Yes.
I'll never. And now I'm just. This isn't even a story about me. There was a kid in one of the schools that I worked at. They caught him on camera walking down the stairs, and he did a caca and like shook out his pants, and it's on the like security where the caca just rolled out from his pants onto the stairs.
What grade is this?
I don't know. I don't remember. It was a younger grade.
First of all, Ashley's face is incredible, right?
Bro, little kids are so gross. We love them. They're so gross, bro.
They are. And you want to test them? We're worried about caca. Like,
they're picking their nose, choosing C. Like
crazy. No, so I'm just really happy and proud. This is like a close to home thing for me, and just like with the idea of testing. That was one of the beauties of the time of like beauty, or I should say silver lining of the time of Rona, was getting rid of all of that testing and like literally just getting to be an educator. I genuinely love that, because the over testing was crazy. And then like they even talked about it in the article that I pulled this from, the fact that the test, you know, you'll have a contract for this amount of years, so then they're getting used to this type of test, and then that contract is gone, and then there's a contract for this amount of years. So now
let's talk about the money involved. Yes.
Thank you.
So much money in that industry.
And I didn't know that when I first got into teaching. I was like, wow, I guess I got to use this data. And then the more I learned, I was like, man, throw it out the window. This is stupid.
Throw it out the window.
Throw it out the window. Testing is trash.
Testing is trash. If you want to educate yourself more about testing, there's a book called The Testing Charade by Dan Koretz, one of our professors, and he just basically, the whole book is about how testing is trash, like literally the whole book.
Love it. A man who speaks my love language.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, on one hand, I'm like, okay, like we need to know if the children can read, right? Like baseline. Yes. Can they read? Yeah. Can they do basic arithmetic and geometry?
And they cannot. That's the final answer.
They cannot. Yeah. You know, if they buy a house, can they measure it and figure out what kind of furniture they should put in it? You know, like real baseline. Obviously, I'm like thinking about home buying, baseline stuff. But on the other hand, yeah, testing culture is effing wild. Like, I remember when I taught in a high school in Nashville, and we literally had a parade. We had end of year testing parade. To like hype the kids up about testing, and it's like, what is this? Like, why is this happening? Like, and it was to like celebrate. Like, I think the goal was to try and like combat test anxiety and stuff like that. Yeah. Which, like, on one hand, like, yes, we should do something to help students with that, but on the other hand, I'm like, why are we having this parade? Like,
oh yeah, there's spirit weeks everywhere. Like, I said Spirit Week. What?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
We just had our park pep rally the other day.
Oh no!
Oh no!
Listen, I had a good time. The pizza was good. Got some good. I know the kids was probably nervous, but that's not my problem. Like,
you just gotta make sure they don't have COVID. That's your.
Yeah. I'm here to make sure that no fights break out, that everyone's safe. But you know, it's fun.
Rally. I saw you on that 360 photo booth. Now that I think about it.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that was from that pep rally. Yeah. We spared no penny. Yeah, I look good. Thank you. That was about me.
Did.
Sagittarius.
That was fun. That looked fun.
No, I am with you, Linda. I'm gonna be a little bit more quiet here because I haven't been in the actual classroom, but I do think that there should be some type of diagnostic, because I do wonder about the difference of like, is the issue with testing itself or what the people around testing and the industries around testing have become? Because, I mean, we still have tests in the classroom, right? And I know I don't want to sound like pedantic, I guess, but like we test to figure out things, like to know, right? So we have quizzes in class to know, right? But big state tests obviously have a lot of things attached to it. So then it's a separate thing. But anyway.
I can speak to it as a reading specialist, right? So like my whole job or the whole thing that I was trained for at Harvard was specializing in reading. And a large portion of what we learned was assessments. And so I want to make sure to separate the word test from assessment. Like we would assess to see where a kid was, the things that they knew, and then how to push forward learning from that, right? Like how to make an individualized plan from that. That is very different than these big national tests, which often test your knowledge of white supremacy culture. And people don't like to say that. But like you can go all the way back to there's an episode of Good Times that when I got into education, I would tell my mom these things, and my mom loves her like making some pop culture references. That's where I get it from. But it was an episode where one of the characters was talking about those tests, and he was saying like he said, what was the example? He said something about that one of the kids didn't know. It was a connection test, right? So you had to know like X is to Y as something is to something else, and the answer was something like cup is to saucer, or like teacup is to saucer. It was something like that, right? And then he was talking about his friend didn't know the answer, and he's like, his family don't even have a coffee table. So he's
insert audience laughter,
right? So, he's just talking about the discrepancy of, like, not knowing certain words because it's not part of your everyday life. And that actually happened to me where I nannied a lot, and I nannied for very wealthy families. And I once nannied in the summer for this family, and the daughter was talking to me about how they would go to a trip to Nantucket all the time, right? And then literally when I was teaching 3rd grade, there was a passage that had Nantucket in it. And it hit me that I thought like, damn, my student over here in Inglewood in Chicago has 0 experience with Nantucket, but this child that I nannied over the summer has experience, and whose background knowledge is going to be activated right away. That is where the depths of the testing part comes in. That doesn't tell me whether or not they recognize Nantucket, doesn't tell me whether or not they can read or comprehend. It literally tells me about your background knowledge and your experience. So and we learned a lot about that even with the assessments, that they were, a lot of the data on the assessments was like middle class white children. So it just doesn't tell a full picture of the average American child, because that's not the average American child.
I mean,
and I'm gonna hop down off my soapbox.
No, please, Professor Alexia.
What was that?
Because I'm not going back to school. I can't do it.
Yeah, I would. I have so many feelings about this, but I think I would start at the conclusion, which is like, education is made for capitalism, right? Our system as is. One of the like ways our system is trash is like, it's made for capitalism, and that shows up in like every single facet of education. One of which is testing, right? One like we just mentioned, like the amount of profit that is fueled through making these assessments, and like all, you know, like College Board, right? I'm just gonna call it whoever owns the ACT. I can't even remember. Like park testing, even like for teachers, right? Praxis testing, ETS, like all these people are making so much money off this stuff. Like part 1, part 2, like test scores is, speaking of connections, test scores is to education as profit is to the private sector. Test scores are profit, you know?
Yes.
Like, they are.
Pew, 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 pew. Bro, we need to add in that track, bro.
Wow.
Booyaka, booyaka, booyaka.
Like, you know, like it's what we're constantly chasing. It's how we prove our worth, our value, right? How kids prove their worth and their value, and how they attach their self-worth and self-value to their test scores. Like, thank God I didn't know what test scores were in 3rd grade, because my test scores were bad. Like, my English test scores were like in the 30th percentile or something. Like, it was not good. Yeah, it worked. It's okay. It's okay. I know you're like inner ELA teacher. It's like, I've got you, little Linda. I've got you. Like, no, it all worked out. We're good. But
thank God.
Yeah, like we chase these test scores, these numbers, as a way to prove ourselves, and like, what are we really proving at the end of the day? It's like, you know, and then the curriculum and everything that's associated with like the content on the tests, right? Like, even nobody ever talks about math, but I'm just going to get on my soapbox as a former math teacher and talk about how the way we teach math is also very capitalistically centered, because we teach arithmetic first. We don't teach geometry first, which we could. We made a choice not to as a country, and actually around the world, arithmetic is usually taught first, because it's mercantile math. It's merchant math. It's what you would need to be a merchant, when in fact the concepts are actually pretty advanced for kids. Like, the concept of zero is actually a very advanced concept. The concept of like decimals and parts, like percentages. But geometry is actually very intuitive, because you can see it and you can feel it, and it can be tactile. So like, it actually could make a lot more sense for young children to start with geometry, but we don't do that, because you gotta make that budget, you know. So like,
and the kids still can't math.
And the kids still can't. I know, it's so sad. It's so sad. Like it is honestly very sad to like be in a high school classroom where the children literally can't add or subtract. Like,
I can imagine.
It's terrible. But yeah,
I had a hard time seeing it in 3rd grade, and I would bring in like class cash and money, because I'm like, this is how we're gonna practice, and to see them not be able to do it, and I'm like, just imagining some of these kids, and I never taught math, so I'm gonna take all this pressure off of me. I taught reading, but to see, this was never my. No, I'm kidding. But to see them and to think like, oh my God, someone could literally rob you at a store just by not giving you the change, because they can see that you don't know what you're doing, you know, and that broke my heart. Like, it really would break my heart to see all of that.
I also think we're the only country that does this sort of end of the year, every year, state level, high stakes testing. I don't know of any other countries personally that do it. Like China, there is high stakes testing as well, but I think it's at the end of every, like, end of elementary, end of middle, and then there's the very famous, like, I'll call it the end of high school, where like children, it's like very bad and way too high pressure. But when I taught in a French school, like it was not every year. It was only certain grade levels as well. Like even NAEP testing, right, which is like our low stakes testing in the U.S. is not done every year. It's like 3rd grade, 8th grade, and it's not every student. It's like a sampling, right, to kind of see.
That is the international testing, isn't it? Isn't NAEP the one that's like worldwide?
No, PISA is the one that's worldwide.
Oh, PISA.
And there's all kind of issues with that. I won't get into that soapbox, but there's all kind of issues with PISA as well, and like people always point to PISA about how like the U.S. ranks really low in PISA, which is facts. But also, I do think that the U.S. actually is more inclusionary in terms of special education than any, or at least most other countries.
Makes sense.
And so it's actually not a fair like comparison because it depends on which students you're including in the PISA test. Like you need to like level on that, which I don't think that PISA does. So, anyways, I could be wrong, but I don't think it does.
So just real quick, because I'm thinking about folks listening, like if they're like testing sucks, like whatever. What are some things that y'all would kind of posit that we pivot towards if we're going away from testing? It doesn't have to be perfect, but just what are some things you think could be towards solutions?
There are experts who talk a lot about this in different ways. That's so sort of like the political scale, right? You can get like really loose, and then you can get really stringent. And there are some folks who say that portfolios are better than tests, right? Like to be able to have students come up with a sampling of the work that represents what they do. Obviously, if you had more of what I did, reading specialists or math specialists, that could assess a child and tell you their abilities, that's better. Also, the standards, the Common Core standards, I actually really love the Common Core standards, at least from a reading perspective. And when I would take those standards, even over grades, I hated grades, still do. If I look at a standard and I can say, with a rubric, on a level 4, you are able to do the things in this standard, or on a level 1, you cannot do these things in the standard yet. It doesn't label a kid as not smart. It doesn't label a kid as like a failure in any way. It's just like, this is the goal of what we're doing. Whereas testing and grading just completely misses all of that when it comes to actual education. That's how I feel. But then you're going to lose out on all that testing money unless Pearson starts doing portfolios. Like, that's really what's going to end up happening. So those folks are going to miss out on that. And then it's with just the number of students that are in the public education system and the lack of teachers and the lack of coverage and funding and all of that, you would never be able to look at a child as holistically as we need to. That's why I loved Montessori when I did like the Montessori public school. I was like, wow, this is like, y'all actually care about the kid individually. You have the capacity to care about the kid. Because I'd say 99% of teachers care about all of their kids. You just don't have the capacity to do it. That's what ends up where testing comes in. And then, okay, we'll push the ones that are doing well and we'll label the ones who aren't as failures. That's what it comes down to.
I'm thinking right now like about how to balance between like, is there a way we can do assessment? I guess I would think of it as like, if we think of it just as data, there does need to be, I feel like I could be wrong about this. I feel like maybe I've been working for like districts and states for too long. So if I'm like,
there she is, government plant.
I know. If I'm like, if I'm like too absorbed in the system, I need y'all to like call me out. Like I feel like,
don't worry, go ahead.
Get ready to drag. Come on now.
Okay. I do feel like there needs to be a way to like measure across the board, like how students in the U.S. are doing. Right? How students in this state are doing, how students in this school district, how students in this school are doing. So, like, I do think that they're, like, can NAEP be reconfigured to kind of be that? But it's not high stakes, right? It doesn't reflect on the individual student per se, right? And it doesn't fall on the individual student, like, but there is some sort of, like, aggregate measure in which we can, like, see, like, are we doing a good job or are we not doing a good job? And then at the teacher classroom level, like, first of all, I was never trained in assessment as a teacher, which I was never trained as a teacher. Let's start there.
Listen, we don't have time for a TFA episode right now.
Okay? Pew, 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 pew.
LOL. I was never trained as a teacher. And so I was literally just making up these assessments like that's not, no. Like creating an assessment is a specialized skill that somebody should do, not just like a rando human who's been put in a classroom, like, so that's one. And then 2, like teachers need to be taught how to actually read the results of the assessment and be given time in their schedule to do that work, because that is part of the work, in addition to actually being in the classroom, but also just kind of shifting the whole frame away from like, and I don't know how you do this, but really talking about it from this is where you are and this is where you want we want you to be. Like, how far are you from that? Are you far? Are you close? As opposed to like, you're dumb.
Yeah.
Right. Like, how do we change that mindset and that culture, which I think is actually the hardest piece, because culture changes always.
That's why I did like the NWEA test that we did. Out of all of the testing that I've ever done and participated in, the NWEA was my favorite, like, you know, the lesser of all the evils, because they thought of education, or they thought of learning as this like ladder, and they gave kids a number, and they were like, at this level you're able to do this, and there was much more we could do with the data. With Park, there was nothing I could do with it there, and by the time you get the Park results,
it's like gone, the next year,
right?
Yeah.
Whereas NWA was very immediate. I would write it down. Okay, I know what level you're at. I know where the average of what you should be by this grade, and this age and all of that. So that was actually usable data. I didn't mind it, but I did have qualms with the fact that, like, when I'm looking at every kid's like passages for literacy, it's all white authors, it's all very like, you know, what's the canon. So there's things that could have been like progressed in it for sure, but out of all of those, I did think that one had the most potential to tell us a real accurate photo of our kids and their abilities. Yeah. So sponsor me, NWA. No, I'm kidding. Sponsor the pod. Let's talk a little bit of crap.
I was gonna say, real quick, I think Linda, you were saying it about talking to a kid like through the results end up being like, oh, you're dumb because you scored this, or you're smart because you scored that. So to kind of mitigate that, at our school, we have our students lead their IEP meeting. So IEP is individual education plan. So usually for students with special education needs. So because of that, it allows the kid to grasp what the data is in a way that, like, no shade, but KIPP is like super data focused. Like, we're like a little bit more loose. Like, you can see your scores, but it's not like you're terrible if you're here. It's like, this is what you need to grow, and like, this is how you can get an A in the class, or like whatever. And because the students have to lead it, they also kind of have to explain the data a little bit too. Like, here's where I started off, and it's quarterly, right? So here's where I was at Q1, here's where I am at Q2, like whatever. And I think that helps a lot. One, because our parents sometimes don't really get it. Like, they might hear the number, but there's no context to it. And if they can't show up to parent-teacher conference, which a lot of them like don't come, but the ones that do, even if they do show up, it's like, how can I then explain to you what this means? Like, if they're along with their peers or not. So the teacher's there and the student is there, and the student can explain where they're at, and the teacher can also add the context of like, yes, we're learning these standards and this is where they are, whatever. So I think that helps, but obviously not panacea for everything.
Yeah. I mean, we could go on and on. Oh yeah, I was gonna say we try to do that too, but of course when the students got a lead and they're not doing so well, then they don't show up, and I'm like, excuse me.
That's also true.
That's where were you? I want to get into more about you, because we've been like spitting things, and I'm sure that folks will know that you're all very smart. But I want to hear more about your background. Yes, give them the hair flip. Give them the hair flip.
If I had hair,
that's for the YouTube folks.
Over for you.
That's for you could have hair if you wanted to.
Yeah, I could, but I'm not gonna buy that bundle. No, ma'am.
Ridiculous. So I want to hear from you a little bit about your education journey, and specifically what I think is really unique and special about us, like all three being in this space. I thought about it this morning, and I was like, we are all from different types of marginalized groups, and some in like different aspects, and you know, intersectionality, Kimberly. And so I really think, for me, part of the stuff that I talk about is how being from or of a marginalized group helped me kind of like analyze the world and my place in education, right? Like, the more successful I got, the more I was like, I need to put my hand back and reach out to other women, other Latinas, other Latinos, other POC, and like, how can I help others and do better. So I want to hear from you all about your education journey, but also how coming from your group or the people that you feel like you represent for has impacted that journey. No pressure. I will say that this is something I thought about a lot at Harvard. Maybe this will spark something for you, because we had this conversation where, you know, Harvard was one of the places that I had never had a student of color orientation. So I had never gone to school, and someone said to me, we acknowledge that your experience is not the norm of what's expected at this school, right? So having someone say that was very impactful. And then it kind of opened my eyes to also being like, well, it's really interesting that when we're in classes, especially something like critical race theory, right? Like when we're in that critical race theory class, the white folks in there are observing things as literally an observer. Whereas most of the POC that I met, I won't say all, but most, felt like they were doing things not just for themselves, they were doing it for their entire community.
Yeah.
You know, it wasn't like you were just going to learn, whereas a lot of the white folks had this privilege where they were going and they're like, I'm just soaking everything in.
Yes.
I'm learning. I want to advance my career. Where I would come in and I'm like, what can I do for all the Puerto Ricans in Humboldt Park? How can I be better, right? Yeah. I've had conversations with you, Ashley, where you're like, I'm just thinking about the young queer kids. Like, how do I do better for them? So that load, it's a pressure. It's a pressure, but it's like kind of a privilege as well to go to Harvard with that goal of like helping our people. That's what sparked the question.
Well, that's a really good primer. And can you ask the question one more time so I make sure I get it right?
The way I formatted it was like, we're all from marginalized groups, so I wanted to know how that has impacted your career and your desire for education.
I can go first. So I'll just talk a little bit about my education journey and how it kind of led up to that too. So my mom's a teacher. She's been teaching for like 20 plus years. Started off in New York City public schools and now is in Clayton County schools in Georgia. But my mom being a teacher shaped my own thoughts around education because she came up from Guyana when she was like 28. So, and then had me at like 29, 30. So it was like new country, new kid, like figure it out. So she went to school to get her degrees and all this stuff. And so I think she didn't want me to have that same struggle. So she like put me into private school, like, and then that led to WashU, and then that led to Harvard. And I just kept seeing how different my experiences were based on like the school that I went to or like the education that I had. Like I grew up in the hood in New York. I grew up in the hood in Atlanta. Like I just kept seeing my life journey was always just a little bit different than the homies, right? Like I didn't think we were particularly smarter, whatever. I was in the gifted classes in New York. Those same people in those gifted classes just had different life paths, right? Like one of the homies, super smart, he's a Crip. Like that's just what he do. That's just where he's at. Brilliant kid, but that's the life, right? So I feel like the way that I approach being at Harvard and being in any spaces where I'm one of, is always thinking about all those other people who I thought were just as smart as me, who are not sitting here right now. Like, how would they feel? What are they thinking? Like, am I being true to them? Like when I open my mouth to speak. And so that's what like guides me. But I definitely feel like being in those classrooms, what you said, Sabrina, like hits a nail on the head. Like other people were in those classes observing. And I felt like every time we went into that critical race theory class, I was like, we have such a gem right here, right? There are white people who are in, particularly white people, or particularly cis people who are in a space, cisgender, who are in a space, ready to listen, willing to learn, and they never have this type of like raw, unfiltered, just listening to whatever the other, like we rarely have those audiences, right? Normally it's like something bad happens, we have to make the case as to why like we should survive, or we should have money, or we should be treated and valued and loved, right? But in this space, it was just people who came to listen, ready to do whatever. So every time we went to class, I felt that burden of like, whatever comes out of my mouth needs to be curated enough, needs to be like, hit all the data points, needs to be whatever. But that meant that we were coming to the class, me, Sabrina, Shantae, we're coming into class ready to like lay down the law, like talk about all these like, historical context and everything. And other people were like, wow, that is so interesting. Thank you for sharing that. I'm like, boy, you ain't bringing nothing to the table. Like we are talking amongst ourselves. Like for me, some of those best educational experiences happened in Gutman with Linda, with Shaliza, with James, with all these people where I was like, damn, I'm sitting here for hours not doing my homework, talking to y'all, not reading a nan thing, just talking to y'all and just gaining so much knowledge in a way that classes didn't inherently always allow for that. Just because it wasn't, sometimes the professor couldn't even contribute. It was just the students talking, it was us talking amongst ourselves.
Our experiences are not documented.
No.
They're not.
Nor are they cherished.
Yeah, they're not in research, right? They're not. I mean, some of the newer research, being done by people of color, women of color, yes. But like the stuff that we're getting in class, like our experiences are not included in that, or not in a way that we find reflective of ourselves. Like, I remember like in our policy class, like we were talking about like discipline, disproportionate impact of discipline, and it was like the graph of a study that was done in North Carolina of black boys that had been suspended. And I remember so clearly James like raising his hand and being like, as a young black man who was suspended from school in North Carolina, and it's like the research paper doesn't talk about that shit. Like, only in those conversations are we able to actually learn about these things. They're not in the canon of white academia.
Or it was like the level of it was so different where it didn't give this like mid-level version either.
Right.
I think that when we were at Harvard, there wasn't a lot of folks who were specifically low income. There was a lot of folks who were people of color and came from more of like a middle class family, and or like family who was like highly educated. And like I remember being like, you know what, none of this research hits that nuance. Like there's a lot of nuance about white folks, but there's not a lot of nuance about POC. Every time I read an article about a Latino, it is about Mexican folks. And that's just not accurate of the demographic of the United States. Like there just wasn't a lot of other things that talked about Central American, Puerto Ricans, Caribbeans, the high Dominican population, you know? So there was just not a lot in academia that addressed that nuance. I think that drove me too, because I was like, I want people to stop thinking that Latino equals Mexican. I want people to stop thinking that. And not that I don't love, you know, I'm 1/8 Mexican, I talk about that, right? Not that I don't love my Mexican brothers and sisters, but it does us all a disservice when you think that the only problem Latino kids have in school is language. Right. That's not the only issue, because there are so many who language is not the issue at all.
Yeah, it's a very similar, both similar and not similar, like I think fight in the Asian American community, where it's like I am Chinese because that's what happened.
What? I didn't know that.
So that was a sign at birth.
Yes.
You were signed Chinese at birth? I'm done.
But, you know, and a lot of the Asian American narrative focuses on the Chinese American community.
Yeah.
But we're not the only ones here. And our story is not the only one. And even within that, there is the nuance of like my parents that came in the 80s through a student visa versus like people who came here, you know, in the 1800s and have been here for multiple generations, or kind of everything in between, right? There's so much nuance to it. And the other thing is like everyone thinks Asian kids do great in school. So they're just like, it's fine. They're even doing better than the white kids. And it's like, okay, first of all, like, if we're doing better than white kids, then, like, shouldn't you be asking what you should be doing more for white kids? Maybe not. I don't know. But I'm just saying, like, you know, it's like, as long as we've surpassed the white kids, we're considered, right, using white as that norm, that standard, we're considered fine.
That's the baseline.
Right? And then on top of that, that's just not true. Like Boston, Chinatown, you know, that community is not high income. That community has definitely been the object of gentrification, of highway builds. That have decimated that community, and you know, there are still people living there and going to school, and like, what services are they getting? The answer is not that many. Or like in New York City, 1 out of every 4 people who are living in poverty in New York City are Asian American, but like they don't get services, you know, they don't get that support. And then there's this whole like specialized testing school situation, right, where like there's all of these, it's predominantly Chinese families whose parents are like all riled up because of this farce of scarcity, right? Like, well, you know, if we start letting Black kids and Latinx kids into the school, then Asian kids can't get into the school, and then we lose, right? And so they're like, they've internalized that narrative and are fighting based on that. And those are also my people, right? So I'm like, oh God, like I gotta go get my people, like, like
you feel this responsibility.
Yeah, 100%, 100%, and it's also very interesting, I think, because, you know, for me, I grew up in communities where there weren't many other Asian Americans in general. And so I was always one of maybe 10. And so I didn't really grow a consciousness around my racial identity probably until my mid to late 20s, which is kind of pretty late. And, you know, it took a lot of conversations and a lot of really awesome friends like you to have these conversations with and help process and all of that.
You're welcome.
Kind of like, yeah, thank you. I'll send the check later.
Yeah.
We'll
call it even.
Okay. But yeah, I think that, you know, a lot of, at least in my experiences, the Asian Americans I've met who grew up in communities where there weren't a lot of Asian Americans haven't grown that racial consciousness and aren't really aware. And it wasn't really until the Atlanta shootings or George Floyd kind of, the murder of George Floyd, I think, was one catapult to kind of like bring a lot of Asian Americans into the racial conversation in general. And then the shootings in Atlanta, like, kind of was like, oh, and also this shit is bad for us too. Like, you know, like made that point of realization. But a lot of people are very new to the conversation. And like, I think a lot of times I think about, when I think about education work, I think about like what can I do to educate my community actually on our own history, because so many people don't know. It's not well documented, and a lot of folks immigrated here because of immigration policy. That's like when they were allowed to come over in the 70s and 80s. So they were going through their own struggle. They weren't like going back and reading about, you know, the 1800s through the 1960s and all the work, you know, that Asian Americans had done to organize and to fight for their rights, and like the Asian American movement's birth in the 1960s. Like people, they're trying to feed their kids, you know, right? They're not thinking about this stuff. So yeah, I think a lot of, for me, I just, I spend a lot of time thinking about like, what can I do to help my own community understand like who we are and where we came from, and like
I love that
in multiple ways. Yeah.
So I came up in education through a more traditional route. Like we talked about that I growing up, it was like, I love working with kids. What are you going to do? Be a teacher, right? That was the only thing I had on my mind. And both of you are in the field of education through non-traditional routes. So can you tell us like a little more about what that route was like for you? I know, actually, I don't even know what your undergrad is in, Ashley, but I know you've done a lot of like activism things. Like I remember reading, you were like, can you proofread this article? And I was like, oh, you're just gonna flex how you led an entire protest and okay, no big deal. Right? She's like, look for the periods and the commas. No, girl, like what? So I know you did a lot of that. I know you have like social justice things like at your heart and your core, but how did it bring you into the world of education?
Yeah, so I was an urban studies major. Shout out to that program. At WashU, and my minor was in African and African American studies. If I could have done it differently, I would have double majored, but it's just a lot of work. But anyway, but being an urban studies major, a lot of classes were interdisciplinary, so I got to take a lot of courses on like race. Like I took a course on Black feminism, and I think that class could have counted for either the African American studies or urban studies. So like that just kind of shows you just all the different like knowledge I was getting. I took like environmental psychology, like all these different things. But anyway, I also got to take a lot of education courses, or courses that overlapped as education courses. And so I would have loved for that to be like another thing on either a major or a minor, but I just kind of couldn't fit into my schedule. And then also, you know, my mom's a teacher too. So like education was always just kind of like there. My mom was so adamant about like me not becoming a teacher, which I don't know if like a lot of y'all feel the same way. Like my mom was like, absolutely not. You can do anything else in the world. Do not become a teacher. And she loves teaching. It's like her passion, right? But she was just like, not for you. But after like being at WashU, right before my senior year, Mike Brown was killed in like August. And like that July, I'd become president of the Black Student Association. So I was coming in thinking like, okay, we're going to, you know, plan some formals, like get together, get the seniors right, and then kind of go off. And then it was, okay, we need to protest. And technically, if we're doing, this was before like, you know, marches and everything were like way more common. It was like, if someone needs to sign off on 200 Black students going into either Ferguson or going into St. Louis, and it's WashU sponsored, right? If we're putting our name on it. Right. And that became me. So now I was like, okay, I have to make a huge decision, because if something happens at this protest, like parents will be looking at me and or our e-board to then say, what happened to my kid? Why did you, okay, you know, like you led this. So it became like a very high stress, obviously because of the murder first and foremost, and then also because there was a huge responsibility, right? So not for my community, right? And this was where I think like my Blackness in my head has always been like, I'm Caribbean. I'm also Black for sure, but I'm Caribbean, yeah? So there was a little bit of a distinction to Black Americans. But at that point in St. Louis, it didn't really matter. It was like, yo, you either care about justice or you don't, right? That's kind of where the line was. So anyway, so after getting back to school, leading protests, like really it was like a student-led effort, like doing sit-ins, like all this stuff, like talking to the chancellor, getting policy changed at school. That kind of led me to think like, what are some other ways that we can like help Black people? And then particularly every time we were at marches, I would always see two distinct groups and flags. There was always a pride flag, and there was always a Palestine flag. So I was like, these two groups are always showing up in these spaces when they don't necessarily have to be, right? It would be like white queer people or just like, you know, Palestinian folks who are Arab, like they would just be present because they were like, yo, your injustice is tied to mine, and like I see it. And so that led me to kind of go to HRC after to work in queer spaces. And then when I was there, I was like, damn, like I really want to work with some queer youth, particularly our Black queer youth. I'm not really getting that direct hands-on type of experience. And so I was like, well, let me go get another degree and like specifically to hone in on education. And then that's what kind of led me to going into CAP and then being at a school. But the nature of a lot of the things that happened, so what Sabrina's referencing was like the Black It Love It page, was my experience in private school was so terrible. Like, people there they were so racist, and they were rich. They were like, I mean, a multi-million-dollar company essentially, like, these private schools are multi-million-dollar companies. And they're there to protect their interests. And so the parents that are there, because they're protecting their investment, which is their child and their legacy. There was a lot of racism, a lack of accountability between the school and the students. And so after George Floyd was murdered, a friend and I just ended up talking about our experience at Love It. We're like, damn, like, we should just kind of like talk to more alum about this. So we created a Facebook group that's kind of blew up, and people just started sharing their stories. We're like, yo, we should anonymize these and make an Instagram, just kind of see what happens. And it just blew up. And so in that experience and the one in Ferguson, it was just like, people are feeling a type of way. Let's just find a way to kind of talk it through. And then that just builds into something else, being like, how do we express this and say that we want something to be different? And then it just kind of goes from there. So anyway, it was a long answer to your question.
No, but it was a great answer, because I think, like I said, the way that you talked about how, like, HRC and even being at which is Human Rights Campaign, right?
Yes, sorry.
Right. So HRC, and then seeing Pride represented at all of these different protests really showed you the ways that you can get to the youth and you can address that intersectionality we were talking about. And I like the way that it was like I feel like I came at education from like learning in children, and then had the race and the social justice and all of that attached on, whereas you came at it the other direction. But both of us are now at this space of addressing it like that. And Linda, I feel like your background, when I learned more about your background, and I was like, she's a boss bitch that ended up in the classroom. Like, what the hell?
Yep.
I know you, and look, and then we have private conversations. You're like, well, when I worked at GE, I had nice bags, and I'm like, oh my god, like, she had nice things. So your story is always so cool to me, and a lot. I joke on my Instagram that you're like my fairy godmother, because the way that you bless me with a lot of the knowledge that you have. Because I don't know a lot of people who are in the corporate world who could talk salary negotiations. We're going to address that in the Q&A. And you have provided me literally dollars in my bank account because of the conversations that you have, but it's because of the experiences that you bring. So please talk about how you tied that world to education and just your journey.
I just have to first say, like, listening, Ashley, to you talk about all the things you do, because like we do just like goof around and like be dumb, like dumb a lot of the time. I like feel like I'm like in the presence of royalty. Like I'm like, damn.
we are. She's a big deal.
This is what I miss so much about being at school, is like just being with all these super amazing people who, like, on one hand, like listening to their stories, like it's like so humbling and inspiring at the same time, because it's like oh wow, like this person did such amazing things, and then kind of being like, oh, like I'm in this person's circle, that means I could do amazing things too. Like I'm at that level, you know. Like I just miss this so much. But either way, yeah. So my journey. So I majored in economics in undergrad at Northeastern, because capitalism. So I thought, you know, I thought I needed a practical major to like get a good job and, you know, be stable and all that kind of stuff. I think very common kind of child of immigrant kind of mentality, right? Like my parents worked so hard for me to be here. I got to do something so I can provide for myself and and let the work and the investment they poured into me mean something and be something, right? So I did that. I applied to GE honestly because I was at the career fair, and I remember going to the Peace Corps table, because even then there was like a pull. Like I was in student government, you know, there was a pull to like service. But the people at the Peace Corps table were not very nice to me that particular day, I guess. I don't know if they were tired or what was going on, but I was kind of like, oh, all right. And the program that...
They're probably underpaid.
Yeah, they are. So they were underpaid. And then I dropped by the GE table just because it was like one of the tables, and the person who was at that table was an alum, which is one of the strategies they use to try and recruit, right? He was an alum. We had mutual friends, and he was like, yeah, GE has this program where you rotate through 4 different jobs over 2 years, 6 months at a time. And I was like, you mean I don't need to commit to one job right now? This sounds amazing. Like, let's do this. Because I was so confused about what I wanted to do, and like really feeling that pull between like wanting to do service, but also like not wanting my parents to worry about, you know, whether or not my paycheck could support me and stuff. So I ended up applying to GE. I got in. And I immediately hated it. I just remember being so miserable. Like, that transition out of college is hard, one. Yeah. And then two, like, yeah, I just hated it. I just hated it so much. But I recognized, like, I could get really good training through this. You know, they have all this professional development that, like, it's really hard. At the time, my perception was, like, it's so hard to grow and develop in the service, you know, government sector because, like, there's no money and there's no money for that kind of thing. So let me stay in the private sector, which now I actually don't know if that's true, but I didn't know any better at the time. So I stayed with GE for 4 years. I traveled all over the world. I lived out of hotels. They paid for all of my, like, living costs. See, that's the thing. When you're in corporate, you work so much that they pay for all your living costs because they want you to just focus on the work. Yeah. Right. And then when you're young, it feels so worth it because you can do things like buy really fancy bags, which I'm currently sitting in my closet. So some of these fancy bags are, like, literally right next to here right now. Still have them. Yeah. But, like,
it's an investment.
It's I don't know what the resale value on these is, but yeah. So I, at one point, just kind of, I had made this whole plan, like, I was going to stay in GE for 4 or 5 years. And then I decided I was going to pivot into education. And I chose education because, again, very sort of, I think, common immigrant child thing is, like, you know, education is the ticket out, right? And at the time, like, that was my belief. Like, if we can just, you know, make education good, everyone will have a ticket out, which I also no longer believe. But at the time, I did. And so that was the plan. And then I remember, like, kind of getting down to the wire, like, shit, okay, like, I'm getting down to the wire. I'm up on, like, 4 or 5 years at GE. I'm supposed to make this pivot into education. And I remember, like, having to tell my parents and being so nervous about it. Like I got to tell them that I'm leaving this, like, very successful. Like, I was going up for promotion to be a manager. I'd won a couple of awards at the company. So everyone was like, oh, yeah, for sure you're going to get promoted. Like, we'd be so surprised if you were. And if I had stayed at GE, I would have been an executive probably before 30 or whatever, right? Like, I just would have had this very young, successful career. And so, you know, to call up my parents and be like, hey, like, I'm walking away from all of that and I'm going to go be a public school teacher in, like, a poor neighborhood because that's what I think I need to do. And they were surprisingly very supportive. I think they were confused, but I think they also rationalized it in their own minds as, like, it's a government job, it's very stable, she's gonna have a great pension. I don't have a pension, sorry, Mom and Dad. No pension.
But you're investing, right?
I'm investing, but I have no pension. And so, yeah, I taught in the classroom for 4 years. I did 2 years in Nashville, Tennessee, public school. The school was, like, I don't know, 99% black kids, which was also the first time I had been in, like, in my adult life that I had been, like, in a non-white environment, which was really interesting. It was the first time the kids had, like, interacted with an Asian person, or for many of them, it was the first time they'd interacted with an Asian person, or especially an Asian adult. So that was a real interesting experience for all of us. Yeah. And then I made the decision to move back to China, because that's where my family was from. I wanted to reconnect with my roots and really understand, you know, I moved back to Shanghai. That's where my family is from. I lived, you know, around the corner from my grandfather's house, which was, like, very close to the neighborhood where my mom had lived and everything like that. So really just, that was also a really interesting experience. Like, any person in the diaspora whose, like, parents chose to leave and then you kind of go back to that home country, it brings up so much in terms of, like, your identity of, like, who you are, who you aren't, like, where do you belong, and, like, really calling that into question, because it's like, I spent my whole life in the U.S. and I felt like I didn't belong there, and then I moved back to China, I don't feel like I belong there either. I'm really stuck in this in-between, and, like, what do I do with that? Where do I go from here?
That's that third culture kid stuff, ain't it?
Yeah, 100%, yeah. So, but I had this 10-year life plan, so I kept going. I had to check off the next step in the plan despite all of these questions that I had. And that's how I ended up at Harvard, meeting both of you lovely women. But yeah, it was kind of this whole thing, like 4 or 5 years at GE to build kind of professional skills, quote unquote, management skills, project management skills. Ended up building a lot of finance skills through that. And then 4 years in the classroom, I wanted to, like, know what is it like to be a teacher. I wanted to have that empathy for teachers. And then a year of grad school to, like, build content knowledge around policy and education in the U.S. And I ended up getting way more than that through all of our hours in Gutman of not doing our homework and just talking. And then what did I do? Oh, and then I went to Miami-Dade, and I worked there in the district in the academics department for a couple of years. And then Miami was not for me. It was not for, it's just not my cup of tea. And so now I'm here in DC and working for the state education agency here. And it is actually so interesting how, like, so my current role, I oversee federal grants, and so it merges my education experience with my finance experience kind of really perfectly.
Yeah, that's like a full circle moment.
Yeah, 100%. It's a full circle moment, but it's also like regularly I question, like, I am the system now. I'm in the system. Yeah. I make decisions. Like, it's a lot to grapple with as someone who identifies as, like, part of a marginalized community, wants to advocate, right, wants to change the system, and then being in the system and being bound by all these rules that I actually don't have the power to change, and really trying to work in the spaces where I do have the power to make change, and often wondering, like, is it even enough? Because it's like when you're a teacher and, like, you have to teach the test. What the hell else are you going to do?
Yeah.
Right.
But the test is fucked, you know?
Yeah.
So like,
yeah.
The calls coming from inside the house. Like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like,
no,
it's
so
like,
true.
it's like kind of grappling with that every day. Like, but really trying to, I mean, I think something I've tried to, like, I don't know if come to terms with is the right word, but just kind of be like, you know what, like, my boss hired me for a reason. And maybe there is someone out there better for this job than me, but, like, right now I have this job.
Yeah, that's
so I got to do what I think I can do until I feel like, you know, this isn't the right place for me anymore. But until then, like, it's my, I don't want to say obligation because that sounds very, like, martyry, but, you know, it's right now I'm in the seat, so I got to drive.
Yeah. It's the responsibility that you took on.
Yeah. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And I think all three of us have that, where you're, like, grappling with this line of being a part of the system, but then actively trying to change the system. And that's something I really struggle with too, because it's like, what is that quote that's like, the master's tools will not dismantle his house and whatnot.
Yes.
You know, and so I recognize that, and I think that I'm trying to make peace with that by also understanding that whatever I do, because I have this mindset to know that I'm never going to tear down the entire system, but the small little things that I do are more than enough. And, like, using our voice is more than enough. The fact that you guys are here right now is more than enough, right? Like, we're doing something in a way that other folks who are just kind of, like, skating by are not doing. And so I give myself a lot of grace. But I think for me, what ended up bogging me down was being within the classroom and not being able, there were certain things that were required of me that I'm like, I don't get to make the decision, like, this is not useful. So, like, they had us doing, like, on-track data in addition to testing, in addition to grades, all these things. And I'm like, I don't need to sit here and waste X amount of hours of my life to talk about whether or not this child is doing well. There are 100 other ways that I could approach this problem, but because I was required as part of my role to do that, I couldn't get bogged down in that bureaucracy. Or, like, the certain trainings that they had us do, it was required of the role, and it was all bureaucracy, and I could not mesh my brain to do those types of things. In the role that I have now, I feel like everything that I'm doing is intentional and purposeful and impactful, whereas I didn't feel that before, and I need to personally feel like what I'm doing is intentional, purposeful, and impactful. That's the long and short of it. You guys are so accomplished, and you're right, Linda, you've also brought my attention to this, where you're like, if this is your circle, you are also that great, you know. And I like to say that there's a quote, like, if I'm the smartest person in the room, I'm in the wrong room.
Yeah.
And that doesn't necessarily mean that I like to say that, like, other people are smart or not or whatever, but I'm constantly trying to go into spaces where I am inspired by other people, or, like, if I present an idea, I want someone to kind of challenge it or build on it. And that's what Harvard, I think, gave to me, and it seems like gave to both of you, is, like, a group of people who are constantly inspiring and elevating. And it doesn't matter what job you have or what role or what career you choose, you should always try to be around people like that. And I'm grateful that y'all are that for me.
I mean, I don't know.
Sure.
I don't know how I would say that Harvard gave that to us.
Yeah, Harvard gave us the space to do it.
Harvard gave us the space to do it.
Yeah, because I was in, this is a question someone else is going to bring up later too about transferring. I transferred grad schools.
Oh.
And part of the reason that I transferred was because the other space that I was in did not provide that level of platform. And so it wasn't so much that like any of the instructors were so amazing at Harvard. It was just like Harvard was kind of a magnet that pulled all those types of people to it.
Yeah.
That was kind of how I felt.
What are these questions?
Yeah. They're so good. Are you guys ready for the Q&A?
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, I think this first one kind of goes along with the conversation that Ashley and I were having maybe sometime last week with talking about charters. So I'm curious about your perception of charters as well, Linda. So this question that came in is, what are the best options for elementary schooling in the current education landscape?
The best options for elementary schooling?
Mm-hmm. Honestly, I think you probably have to talk to like a parent about this, but my push would be for I've heard good things about Montessori schools. Our school is a high school, but we're attached to a Montessori school, so we get to see like the kids playing and stuff, and like just the way that they interact with each other seems like a little bit different than normally in like public school spaces. They're a lot more tactile. They're like, when they're playing, it's like they're also learning, like you can just kind of tell they're outside doing like lessons and stuff, and so it just seems a little bit more hands-on. The school's like smaller, but I would say that for elementary schools. But I really think it's a place where like, are you going to feel like your kid's growing? Like, I feel like this is the piece where like parents just also have to like check in and like tune in. Like, do you know your kid? Do you know what your kid needs? Are you able to find out people who can tell you that or give you resources towards that? I think that's like probably most important, because I would argue my mom is like an amazing teacher, right? She's worked in public schools her whole life. I don't know if she would say all her coworkers are amazing, no tea, no shade, but like, you know, she always ends up getting nominated for like teacher of the year, or like whatever. And then like, yeah, so I do think that there are gems in public school spaces, and I don't want to make it a pro or anti or whatever. But I do think that finding a teacher that cares is going to be like the first step.
Yeah, first of all, I would say like my answer is tailored more towards like a family that has resources.
Okay.
Right, like you can, that you like are interacting with your kid, that you've probably taught your kids some math before they even went to school. You taught them how to write their name in the alphabet before they got to kindergarten, right? Like a family where the parents have bandwidth to be able to do that with their children. I do think that in the earlier grades, like social emotional is more important, but I feel like social emotional often gets twisted as like making sure kids are happy, and like that's not actually what that is, right? Like a school that actually teaches like self-regulation, self-advocacy, empathy, how to talk about your feelings and express them in ways that are like healthy. And that doesn't mean you're happy all the time, right? That means that like when you're feeling really mad, you don't punch the other kid. You just like go, you go sit in the chill corner for a minute and like get yourself together and then come back, right? Like, like actually teaches kids those types of skills, because if they can get to that point, they can learn the academic part. They can figure out the academic part, but that social emotional also I think really requires interaction with their peers. Like it's hard to teach at home because you don't have 15 other children running around. Well, I hope you don't have 15 other children running around in your house, because that sounds exhausting. So yeah, I personally would look for a school that prioritized that, because I would have the capacity at home to like kind of do some academics and stuff with my kid before they went off to school. But the other is like, I don't know, I think the whole school choice thing is just like another political piece of shit, like honestly.
It comes down to it, yeah.
First of all, the amount of time and effort that I see parents expending on trying to pick a school for their child is so stressful. Like, I think every parent should be able to know that they can put their kid on a school bus or the metro or whatever, and their kid gets to school and it's going to be fine. Like the neighborhood school, it should be fine. 2, I recently learned that charter schools actually were not, like, I think people tie the beginning of charter schools often to like this Al Shanker speech, who was the president of a teacher union back, I think, in the 60s or 70s, and being like, look, like charters, were supported by teachers unions in the beginning, and like they're about innovation and like bringing innovation into the education space. But 1, the charters I've seen have not really been that innovative, and then 2, personally, the ones that I have personally, visited, and 2, the actual origin of charters was with Republicans who wanted to deregulate the public education system, and this was their way of doing that. They wanted to deregulate the space. And education is a public good. I generally don't believe in deregulation anyways. And like, you got to make sure everyone has equal access to high quality education, period. And if you deregulate the space, that's not going to happen. So I think school choice just puts more ownership on the individual. versus having society bear that ownership of like providing good education to everybody.
I like the way you frame that. I have cousins who have kids in school, and they know that I am a public school advocate, that I'm like, really writing for public schools. But I would tell them all the time, like, there is also this reality that if you have a child in this day and age right now, and your goal is to get them what you feel like is the best education possible, you should not let anybody like shame you into sending your kid to a public school just because you want them to go to a public school. If the charter is the best, the charter is the best. Like, I understand that, because at the end of the day, you're a parent. My problem, like what you're saying, Linda, is that education, it should be that a public school is just as good, and that perhaps a charter is able to, address education in a different way, sort of like an art school of some sort, or a STEM school of some sort. And it doesn't necessarily have to be that like charter equals better, public equals bad. It should not be that. But the reality in this day and age is that's kind of what's going on, is that charter supposedly equals better, public equals bad. I also did a little stint in Montessori when I was doing my internship in Cambridge. It was at a Montessori elementary school. And there are so many things, like no institution at this moment is very perfect, but because it was public, it was really cool to see the way that there was access for, all the kids in Cambridge to get to this school. I also analyzed the funding levels, and the Montessori was funded higher per student, but they had more access to, different learning materials. Also, they loop. So with Montessori, and I should get like a Montessori person on this podcast at some point. They start from like grade 3, and then I want to say they stay in the same classroom until not first grade, that'd be crazy, maybe kindergarten, and then they go like first, second, third, and then fourth and fifth are in a classroom. So the fact that you're looping has always been shown to be better for the students overall. The freedom that they have, if today you don't feel like working on your math right now and you want to go work on reading, you can do that, but then you learn how to time manage, and so you learn how to pick up things when you need to. I love education like that. It's just it's inaccessible with Montessori right now, because there's not as many Montessori public schools. There's not as many teachers who are Montessori trained. There's also, in Montessori classrooms, there's always 2 teachers, so you automatically have or it's a teacher and a teacher assistant, I believe, but like you automatically have multiple adults in the room, even in 4th and 5th grade. That's unheard of in so many of these other public schools. So yeah, it's just, I think like what you were saying, Linda, it's a lot of shopping around. I think parents don't actually shop around. They just expect that whatever, or in my experience, it's like whatever the neighborhood school is, that's what it is, and what you get is what you get. And it might even come down to this like this is what I'm offered, and it's just what it's gonna be type of mindset. Like, it's the school choice is on the bottom of your list in your life, and you're kind of going through all your other stuff, but it is, shopping around is probably one of the smartest things. Or just staying out, even if they are at the local public school, knowing what your child is learning, knowing the teachers, having communication, the principals, all those sorts of things. So okay, the next question, I don't know if any of you know this, and I wish that I had Joelle to answer this, because she might know with being higher ed. But this question is, why is there so much help to transfer for an undergrad but not for a master's level degree? And this is from a first-gen student.
Well, first of all, we don't give enough supports to first-gen students, period. Let's start there. Just in general.
Right? That's very true. I had a thought that maybe it's because a master's level is seen, it's a professional degree, and so it's seen as like an additional thing that you do. So there's not a lot of support in general, because it's probably with this understanding that you already been through undergrad, you know what's what, and that's it. Yeah.
I think overall we push support towards undergrad way more than we do grad, particularly for that reason. Like, I'm trying to think, like, even at WashU, like, the undergrads got everything, the programming, the money, the, like, buddy system, everything was, like, way more fleshed out in terms of, like, getting them to cross that line within 4 years, too. Like, if you were like on there was no 5-year track, it was 4 years or bust type shit. Well, not like if you were 50 year it was like bad, but there was probably 2 of you, like, it just didn't happen. But for grad students, they'd be like, all right, good luck, be well, like, and WashU has like a very significant law school, business school, and school of medicine. I think maybe the school of medicine got like a little bit more, but yeah, I do think that there's something there about like, you're an adult, you should know how this works. Self-advocate for yourself. Okay, bye.
I think there's also a lot more, maybe not with law school or like more specific degrees, but there's just a lot more specialization happening at the master's level. And so it might be like Harvard was a 1-year program. A lot of other places are 2-year programs, and they're not all like Vanderbilt's ed program is like in their public policy school. It's not even in their own separate school. So it's like public policy degree with like a specialization education, versus like Stanford does have its own ed school, but it's 2 years, you know, and like it's just much more nuanced. And so I think it actually makes it harder to transfer.
Yeah, Harvard wouldn't even take any of my credits. That's what I was at Cal State LA, and I had to sign papers saying that I was leaving the Cal State LA program and like commit to dropping it to then go to Harvard, because I guess they didn't want me to be in both at the same time, which like who could? Right. But then like Harvard, you took everything out of me for those 9 months. Like, that was the hardest. Screaming. I remember this was like the funniest thing that was ever said when we were there. Like Jabari, our friend Jabari, and I were talking about working out, and I was like, I'm not working out. I'm not even going to try to do it while I'm here at grad school. This is just, it's too much. I am going to let go. I was like, there's just too much on my plate. And Jabari's like, that's the problem. There's too damn much on my plate.
Wait,
like in the dining hall. Yeah, so he was holding his dining hall plate. But anyway, it was way too intense. There was no way I would have done a dual program. But yeah, they made me sign that over, and they were like, you're gonna do the classes that are required here. There is no transferring. There is no, oh, I already took this class, I don't have to take it over here. They just didn't even, for me, they didn't even allow it. But there was someone that we went to school with, and I do think I remember her saying they transferred like 1 or 2 classes for her. But it was like a really difficult process for her to even get those approved.
I mean, there's also no incentive for the institution to really help you. You know, like, why would they help you leave? You know, you're not going to be paying tuition to them anymore. So
right. Or why would they help you pay less tuition by transferring credits over?
Versus like for undergrad, I think it becomes common enough of an activity that like it becomes more of a logistical burden to not have an office set up to support you do that. And then there's also, I think, a precedent set with like public universities, right? Like in a public state university, like the SUNYs or like the Florida States or, you know, all the California schools, like it's all part of one system. So they have that set up, and it's like it sets a precedent of like how to do that and whatever. And it kind of forces private universities into that. But master's programs, like, you know, there's just no incentive.
That's real. All right, this last question has been such a hot button question on my Instagram. No, it's a great one. Then transferring to all of my group chats, and then just like life in general, friends coming to me when they're getting jobs. And it's about the verbiage used for salary negotiation. Now, the verbiage that I use, I'll have to preface and say that I had never had to negotiate a salary until this most recent job, because, you know, when you're teaching, it's step and lane and that's it. And that was part of what frustrated me, because I taught reading, writing, and social studies integrated in my last role. I created my own curriculum, and I even at the end when we had to put in grades, I had to put in literally 3 times more grades than anybody else, but that didn't affect my pay when I was doing more work than other people. And so I liked the fact that I was able to negotiate a salary. Now, when I first got my job, and I remember showing Linda, like, they said the salary is from this to this, and you're like, okay, that means you can ask for this much more. And I was like, what? Like, I thought if they told me it's this and this, like, I can ask only for this, like, the higher amount of that. But you said more. So, like, talk to me about, like, salary negotiation, even where you got your like, verbiage from, because, Ashley, you did the same thing, too. You had to negotiate your salaries as well. So let's talk about that.
I have to shout out my friend Joan Moon at Moon Negotiations, MOON. I hired her to be my negotiation coach when I had to negotiate for my first salary, and she's a woman of color, so she's like very passionate about helping other women of color. And in the way that she coached me and helped me, like, I felt like she set me up to be able to negotiate my own salaries after that, right, for any other job thereafter, because she just imparted so much wisdom about like how to approach the salary negotiation, addressed my fears around salary negotiation, and like showed all this kind of like research about like how my fears were not fake, but like in fact women who negotiate and ask for more can be seen in a negative light, right? And that's very real. And so kind of like addressing that and being like, given that you can experience that backlash as a woman, and especially as a woman of color, here's how you can approach that conversation to like preempt that. So I just have to shout her out. She's super awesome. Hire her. She's super great. So one of the things I learned from Joan was that salary negotiations can often feel like it's automatically going to be an adversarial conversation. but it actually doesn't have to be. And it's actually just a conversation about expectations. And it's the first expectations conversation you're going to have with a potential employer. And so it's not like, and you're also not asking for someone to give you money out of their own pocket. You know, like it kind of can feel
like it though.
Yeah, like it's like I'm not asking you to cut a check, like, you know what I mean? Like, this is like about what I'm bringing to this organization and what you should want me to be a happy, satisfied employee, because that means I'm going to do better work, right? Yep. So like that is how the conversation should be framed and laid out, of like, here's what I think I'm bringing to the table. Here's what I'm bringing to the table. I know. Right? Yeah. Here's what I think I can do for this organization, et cetera, et cetera. And here's what I think that's worth. And then let them respond to that, you know, like, and you don't need to defend your position. You don't need to feel like you need to prove yourself. You know, it's just like, this is what I'm bringing, and here's what I think it's worth.
Especially because you've already proved it on the way into that conversation.
And I have to say, as someone on the other end of the table now who does interviews, I'm like, if I've selected a candidate who I feel strongly about, I'm going to fight for that salary for that person. Unless what they've asked for is so far out of the range of what I can do, like budget-wise, like, you know, like if it's something I can accommodate for, and that it's A, something I can accommodate for in the budget, and B, something that is actually fair in comparison to what my other staff is making. Like, if both those boxes are checked, like, I'm going to try and make it happen, you know?
Yeah. How about you, Ashley? What are some of the words that you used in your negotiation? You had a whole deck, didn't you? You had to make a presentation to your boss?
I did. I didn't like have to, but that's how I did it because I'm extra. But
wait, for the salary negotiation, you made a deck?
I made a pitch. She was like, oh, let's have a formal meeting where I make a pitch for having a raise, because I was just doing a lot of work, and I was like, bruh. But also, like, I think everything that Linda said probably like holds more weight, because I think like that's a great way to approach it. It's a great way to kind of talk about it. So I'll just focus more on the other end of like, I think a lot of that happens when you know you're either ready to leave a job or like where your worth is. Like, you have to feel comfortable within that. So when I went to my boss, I was like, look, I'm ready to be out. Like, I don't know what to tell you. And then she was like, okay, well, let's talk it through before you do anything, like whatever. So like that conversation was me being like, here's what I think I'm worth, and here's how I'm presenting it. So I talked about like, here's what my original job description said. Here's a second entire job description that I wrote for another person whose job that I'm doing right now. Like now that I'm doing all of these things and I've laid it out for you, here's how much folks would be making if they were at my level. So I kind of did the comparison of like, you know, I'm newer in a school, but I have like 6 years worth of experience. But then, you know, for some of the other folks that have been here who have less years of experience, but maybe they're older or whatever, like, they're getting this amount of money, but they're not really necessarily doing a good job. I'm like, I know I'm a pitch hitter. If you need me to play X role for a day, I can do it and I'll figure it out. And you know, I'm reliable enough that like, if you're out or if something happens, I can step in. So I'm like, that in itself is hugely valuable, especially because now I'm on the leadership end. So I just see that like on the other end, it's just not inherently there. Yeah. So knowing that I'm like one of few made me more confident to go into the meeting and be like, look, this is how much I think it should be. Here's what my peers are making. Here's what I'm making. Here's how race plays a role into that. Here's how gender plays a role into that. And here's how years of experience, like maybe if you're saying this, but in terms of me doing 2 separate jobs, like that we literally had to hire someone else for, that's where I'm coming from. So I think that helped a lot, and the framing helped a lot. Because then also, like to Linda's point, then I talked about like, here's what I want to do for next year. And here's the ways that you've seen me execute on existing projects. So you know that I'm going to get this done next year too. So when I say it, I'm going to do it. And again, those intangibles are the things that kind of make it stand out more.
I'm glad you said all that too, because I don't know a lot about negotiating a raise. And that's where, like, that's a whole nother level. Like, so I've negotiated the salary. Now I'm in the role. And I'm like, wow, there's going to be a lot more people management than I initially understood from the role. So like that is going to make me go back and be like, well, maybe I need to get a little bit more because I'm managing more people than what I understood from the jump. Yeah. So I like that you said that.
I think there's a distinction too, because I think in my last role at CAP, the Center for American Progress, where they underpay, they do not pay.
Oh, they've been getting dragged, right?
Yes, rightfully so. Amen. I also used to be on the union board, so in my role, I knew everyone's salaries, and I was like, "Wow, y'all gonna do it like this? Pero okay." So when I was at that role, they were just not trying to pay. It kind of didn't matter. I could have made the best PowerPoint, the best pitch. You were going to get 3% for cost of living and then maybe extra depending on how your boss felt about you. It was very arbitrary. There was the standardized system of evals all hinged on, is your boss going to go to bat for you when HR says, no, we're not doing that? And HR says no to like 80% of the people, right? So like that's just how it goes. So one, having a boss that was open in this role, having a boss that was open to that and knowing that like she wanted to keep me, because I was like, I'm ready to just go to tech and call it a day. So having her do that. And then two, when I was at CAP, I also learned that like there was a little bit more of the emotional end of like, I feel like I'm working hard for this company. And technically I am. But there's a lot of other people that are working really hard. None of us should be working past our 40 hours for a week, but there are a lot of people working 50 and 60 hours, and they might be getting like overtime, but what is overtime if you're making like $50K a year under that, right? Like, it really doesn't mean that much. So you might get pushed up to like 55 at the end of the year, but your body, your soul, you're tired, you're burnt out. Yeah, so even like thinking about that, I was like, me feeling like I'm working hard, like personally, I'm just like, oh my gosh, I'm caring about this, I'm thinking about this. Those weren't as tangible in the same way, because my boss kept saying, well, you're not an expert in policy. I'm like, how do I become an expert in policy? Let's walk it. If I want to get to senior policy analyst, walk me back. So I'm talking about for next year. What do I need to do between now and next year to get that promotion? She's like, you need years more of experience. That was arbitrary as hell. There are other people who are senior policy analysts who had 0 experience, right? Some people who had 8 years of experience. Some people who were associate directors with like 2 years of experience. So it's super arbitrary. But you're the person that's holding the key for me. You tell me I need years more of experience, which means I'm stuck here making the same amount of money with 3% raise every fire. I don't want that. I'm out. Be out.
Yeah. Something I love about us / our generation is like this ability to be like, you know what? Like, this is not, even if I get rejected, quote unquote, because, you know, the salary I asked for was too high or whatever, that's not a place I wanted to be at, right? It's not a reflection of like who I am, what I bring to the table. It's like they didn't value me, and so that's not a place where I want to be.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both so much for being here. I am so happy to have you on this first episode. Where can people find you online, if of course you want to be found, right? I know some of us want to stay a little bit private, but where can people find you? What are your handles? What are we looking at?
My Twitter handle is agjeff12, and that is the only place you'll find me on the internet. Thank you.
I guess folks can find me on Instagram. I'm like, wow, this makes me feel a little bit old because I'm really not active on Twitter, and I'm not as active on Instagram anymore. But if you message me and you're legit, I will respond. And my handle is, you know, you get like spams and bots and stuff. But my handle's at PC, so the letter P, the letter C, _ Miss, MISS, Sun, SUN, at PC _ Miss Sun.
What's the PC for?
It's the school I started my Instagram when I became a teacher, so it's the acronym, or the initials, I guess, of acronym. Yeah, the initials of the school that I taught at.
Cool.
Well, I am Esla Maestra on Instagram and Twitter. This podcast is on Twitter at itsalltrash_pod. You guys can go ahead and follow us, and of course we'll tag you, Ashley and Linda. And thank you guys again so much for being the first guest on our
Thanks,
first
y'all.
episode. And I'll talk to you guys soon. Bye.
See ya.
Bye.